Date with a Debut is recorded and produced on Awabakal country, and I pay my respects to all elders past and present and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show. Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you're looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, host of the show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoyed the show, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review. It really helps the show out. If you also want to hear episodes when they drop, be sure to subscribe to Words and Nerds, or you can subscribe to Date with a Debut on Podbean to hear the latest episodes as they drop. Want to support the show more? You can also subscribe to my Patreon in the description to get early access to episodes, book reviews, recommendations, and a whole lot more. Wherever you are listening, thank you for listening to us and supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. Welcome to the first episode of Series 3, and to kick off the new season, I'm delighted to share with you a special episode recorded live at the 2025 Newcastle Writers Festival, recorded on April 6th of this year on Awabakal and Worimi country. In this episode, I got the chance to chat with Lisa Kenway, author of All You Took From Me, Zahid Gamieldien, author of All the Missing Children, and Natasha Rai, author of An Onslaught of Light. We will discuss mild spoilers, so I recommend getting yourself a copy of these 3 excellent books right now in the description. Or at least, get a copy very soon. Lastly, all 3 books contain intense subject matter, with An Onslaught of Light covering topics of suicide, so reader and listener discretion is advised. Well, welcome, one and all, to this special session at the Newcastle Writers Festival. I'm Nick Wasiliev. I'm an author of a book called When Men Cry, and I'm also the host of a podcast called Date with a Debut, which is broadcast on Words and Nerds. And I'm very excited to share with you this live episode of our show, which is going to be the opening episode of Season 3 of the show. So, myself, along with the Newcastle Writers Festival, acknowledges that, first of all, we meet on unceded country, the lands of the Awabakal and the Worimi peoples. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage beliefs and continuing relationship with the land, waters and community. And we pay our respects to elders past and present, and for any First Nations people joining us, we welcome you warmly. Housekeeping, before we dive into our session. Firstly, we ask that all mobile phones be switched to silent. Secondly, if you are on the socials and you've come to the festival to see a favourite author, case in point right here, let the festival know. We are elated to have you here and supporting the festival. You can search Newcastle Writers Festival on Instagram, Blue Sky, Facebook, use the hashtag NWF2025. And then lastly, if you have any questions, we will have a Q&A at the end of this session. Once this session is concluded as well, you'll also have the chance to meet these incredible authors for a book signing, which is located at the Festival Bookshop. So, with that in mind, welcome. Today we dive into the world of debut writing. Everyone gets their start somewhere. How does one publish their first novel? What are some of the challenges people deal with and do and don't talk about? How does one learn their craft telling stories? It's these questions that inspired me to launch the podcast, Date with a Debut, to hear about authors and their journeys to publication. And I'm delighted to be back here at the festival again, launching the new series with an amazing 3 selection of authors here who I will now introduce. First of all, at the end, hello, so far away over there. Zahid Gamieldien, he's a writer, tutor, screenwriter and former lawyer. His work has been included in so many places, Overland, Meanjin, Kill Your Darlings and more, and we'll be discussing his debut novel, All the Missing Children, which is published by Ultimo Press. In the middle is Lisa Kenway, Australian writer. She's an anaesthetist. Her debut novel, All You Took From Me, was listed for the 2020 Rishel Prize and was the runner-up at the CYA conference competition, and it was inspired by her long-standing fascination with memory and consciousness. It was published in 2024 by Transit Lounge. And then lastly, right next to me, Natasha Rai, whose work has appeared in Australia's first Me Too anthology, Enough Already. She's been published in Overland, Verity La, Stylus Lit and more. Her debut, An Onslaught of Light, was longlisted for the 2017 Rishal Prize, the 2018 KYD Unpublished Manuscript Award, and was highly commended at the Ultimo Press Westward's 2020 Prize. And finally, in 2025, it was published by Pantera Press. Give them a warm welcome. I will also finish with a small trigger warning in regards to An Onslaught of Light, which does contain suicidal themes, so reader discretion is strongly advised for that one. So I think the best place to begin is doing a deep dive into every novel, and I think the best place to start is with you, Zahid, at the end. First of all, let's give us the classic elevator book pitch. What is All the Missing Children about?
So All the Missing Children is a literary mystery drama novel with creeping supernatural elements. It's about the effect that the enigmatic presence and mysterious disappearance of two children has on various characters, from their put-upon mother to a suspended detective who's obsessed with a cold case. And as these stories are told, as we get further and further away from the children's lived experience, clues in the book allow the reader to piece together the mystery of what happened to the children.
This is a fantastic book. I'm just going to say straight up, it's a mystery, there's ambiguity, and I think the great words that describe your book, it's eerie, and there's a foreboding, creeping theme that just moves through it. The mystery of not knowing makes it so much worse. It allows your imagination to run wild. It's divided into 5 sections with 4 kind of interludes, each one told from the perspective of a different character. We follow like a real myriad. They're a real interesting myriad of characters. They're very, like, I kind of want to poke you about every single one, but then otherwise we'd truly be here all day. You have Eileen, first and foremost, who's kind of this mother on the bones of her ass. She has a struggling with a gambling addiction, but she's got these children who she seems and feels more and more distant from with every passing moment. We have the former cop, Amar, who, he spends his life in hotels and his life is full of ghosts. My personal, the one I really gravitated towards was Benji, who's a heroin junkie, who, he means well, but he has made so many poor choices in life. And then, of course, Nira as well, who, she's kind of got a story in the country, but there's so many haunting parts. And then, of course, the final story, which we will not spoil. We won't spoil that one, but it's very critical. You hit us where we live with this book, via children.
Oh, I thought you meant literally where you live.
Literally, yeah, true.
I sort of didn't realise it was that personal to you.
Yeah.
But, no, I think, part of what inspired the book was when I was coming up with the idea, my wife and I were thinking about having children. And so this idea of the potential presence or potential absence of children in our lives was really on my mind. And there were also a lot of missing children cases that were in the news, Madeleine McCann and William Terrell. And so I was thinking about the effect that those disappearances had not only on their families, but on the public consciousness at large, and the way these disappearances of children that we don't necessarily know have a kind of haunting effect in the way that we approach spaces and communities, and in some ways the way that we think about life. Like people might think that there's a grand conspiracy to steal children, or they might think there's metaphysical evil that exists in the world, all as a consequence of those disappearances. And so that's part of what I was trying to do with the novel. And if that's hitting people where they live, then I'm guilty.
Yeah, Madeleine McCann was the first thing that came to mind, as well as, the Beaumont children as well, looking back over history. It cuts, I think, trying to kind of summarize the book, it felt like you were kind of diving into human frailty. Like, it's like these characters, there's resilience and everything, but also frailty is really seeped into their bones. What was it like actually writing about frailty and kind of what you wanted to say with this story?
Well, part of what I really wanted to do with this book was generate empathy for characters that we often deem unworthy of it. And those are characters who are in difficult or precarious situations and who make decisions that compound their situations and actually make them worse. And so many times we leave these people on the bones of their asses, as you said, and we think it's because they deserve it. But in fact, they're really worthy of our empathy and we should be helping them.
Yeah, there's so much to dissect. These characters, like so many times I had moments where I was like, no, please don't do that, or whatever, which is, again, what great writers do. And empathy is critical. And that's similar for you, Lisa, with your book. I can't, all you took from me is such a fantastic examination of empathy, but also confusion. What is it about?
Are you saying that there were a lot of times when you said, don't do that? Because yes, that's what it's about.
It's true.
So All You Took From Me is a psychological thriller, and it's set between the Blue Mountains and a fictional Sydney hospital, and it follows the story of an anaesthetist who wakes from a coma after a serious car accident to find she's lost her husband and most of her memories from the last few months. And then upon leaving hospital, starts to notice that there's a stranger following her and she doesn't know who he is or what he wants from her. Then sometime later, still dealing with memory loss, still grieving her husband, she gets back to work and starts to suspect that an anaesthetic drug might help her access those missing memories. But, to do so would put her life and her career at risk. So she sets that aside, but the unexplained threats escalate. She starts to fear for her life. She starts to expose secrets about her husband and a mysterious club that he was involved in, and decides that she might need to take matters into her own hands to learn those secrets and who this man is and what he wants from her. The question is, how far is she willing to go?
And she learns so much about herself in that. It's so... I think the great way to describe this book, it is a real slow burn of a thriller, but what a payoff. When this book hits us with a payoff, it pays off. It is a... I'm sorry.
I think the Women's Weekly described it as a slow burn that bursts into a raging inferno.
I like that one. That's great. Claire, our protagonist, has such a complex journey. She is an anaesthetist herself. She works in the medical world. She understands so many of those processes, and then the kind of examination of grief is so fascinating, because not only is she trying to piece together exactly what happened, she doesn't know, but she's also trying to process the loss of Ray, and then when this mysterious figure starts to appear in her life and really challenge her, suddenly everything is thrown into question. It's increasingly hard for her to cling. There's nothing sane that she can quite cling to. First of all, tell us about the art of writing a slow burn, because it definitely is that. This is she personifies that kind of building intensity, and I felt it kind of came through in Claire as well as the book itself, because she's learning as she learns more and more. She becomes increasingly reckless and makes increasingly bottled decisions that suddenly you're like, it suddenly all makes sense now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about tension, writing a slow burn. I think I've chosen to write it first person, present tense, to be very visceral and sensory, to try and immerse the reader. Because she's got amnesia, that in itself creates tension, that not knowing what happened in your own life and questioning yourself and your loved ones. And all of those things layer the tension from the beginning. But then because she's trying to figure it out, trying to uncover what happened, trying to fill those gaps in her memory, the reader is carried along on that ride. So, I mean, I think the secret in my mind is immersing the reader, creating a character that they want to go on this ride with, and then asking questions the whole way along. So, if each chapter raises a question, perhaps answers one that was raised before, that's enough to propel the reader through the story without having explosions and gunfights and what have you.
It's certainly a story where sometimes the ambiguity makes it even, again, like kind of similar, like the thing when things are left to the imagination, it makes it even worse and terrifying and asks so many questions. And questions are another part that comes up in your book, Natasha. What is An Onslaught of Light about?
Okay, so An Onslaught of Light is about a family, the Sharma family, who moved to Australia from India in the 90s. So it's told through three viewpoints: Vijay, the dad; Indu, the mum; and Archana, or Arch, who is their daughter. So we meet Arch in the present day, and she's living a very isolated life, estranged from her family, which she thinks she loves. And then she is forced to go and check up on her father because her father's neighbour calls her because she's really worried about Vijay. So despite her reluctance, she has to go look after him for a while, and in doing so, she has to confront big family grief, as well as her own cultural and queer identity.
It's a book that really lives up to the title, honestly. This family has gone through some serious trauma. You cover so much ground in this book: generational trauma, family estrangement, mental health, sexuality, racism, but also ultimately forgiveness and unconditional love, which I think really kind of comes through. And you know, we follow these characters, Vijay and Indu and Arch, across these dual timelines. And Arch and Indu really kind of stood out to me in a strange way. Like, not to say that Vijay's timeline is lesser or anything like that, but Arch, she has a long growing identity that seems increasingly at odds with her family and questions of sexuality, and she kind of starts to pull herself away a little bit. And yet, ironically, she kind of followed her mother a little bit, but for completely different reasons. So India kind of goes through, she's separate from the life that she had in India, and in India, when she was surrounded by her family, she kind of seemed most in her element. And there's also like the pressures of being a parent as well that adds to that. Tell me about examining generational trauma, because I know that this is something that you have deep dived and examined a lot over your writing.
Okay, that's a big question.
I know it is, I'm sorry.
Okay, so I guess what I was thinking about when I was writing this is what we pass on to our children. And it's not just the things that are good or traditions, it's also, when we don't mean to, the things that live in our bodies, like pain and wounds that maybe are not visible. So I was thinking from that angle when I was writing that. And, it's a difficult thing to write about in terms of fiction, because I don't want to be heavy-handed or kind of didactic. So I was just focusing very much on these three people, their history, and how that history impacts their present.
It's such a great book, and I think a great place to start. When we were kind of like initially discussing and talking about this panel and everything together, we started to notice that there were some real overlapping themes in a lot of these books, and I think it's kind of nice to kind of dive into those themes a little bit now when examining your books in that process. And the first one that we really noticed was resilience. There's a lot of resilience in all of these characters and all of these books. And Zahid, I want to start with All the Missing Children first, because you've got these different characters, different perspectives that all seem distant at first, but increasingly become connected. These are characters that have been marked by the world. They've been broken, but there's also a lot of strength in all of them. But there is also moments, the consequences of when you give in sometimes. I mean, Eileen's story absolutely broke my heart at the end, when she kind of fell back into a coping mechanism around her gambling.
Spoiler!
I know, sorry. Don't worry, there's about 30 more. I mean, Benji, again, he's so well-meaning. He's kind of been trying to fight off his drug addiction, but he's also so clumsy. And then there's the children themselves, who become the subject of the matter when they disappear, who rely on each other despite the lack of understanding of the world that they have. Resilience comes in many forms with your book, and it changes per individual, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of what I was getting at before, because I obviously think resilience is a good thing to cultivate, and in fiction, resilience in the classic sense is always present, and it's present in all three of our novels, where characters face adversity and find ingenuity and strength to overcome that. But I am wary of the way that the term is sometimes weaponized against people, where it's like, if you do not have resilience, then your situation is your own fault. And that's part of what I'm dealing with in the novel, where these characters are in awful situations, and sometimes when you're in those situations, the full spectrum of choices, including positive choices, aren't necessarily visible to you. So if you're at the bottom of a hole, you might not necessarily be able to see the light up above, and you might accidentally dig down and make your situation worse. And I want to communicate that, we shouldn't judge or shame people for those sorts of choices. But I think, as you allude to, there is a way in which that can be seen as a sort of resilience, because the alternative in some cases could be even worse than the negative coping mechanism that the characters resort to.
I feel like the actual examination of resilience comes, the thing that really stuck out to me was that kindness kind of often feels like it's absent in many of these stories, and then only when people allow kindness to allow them to both not only give kindness but receive it. It kind of became a recurring motif when I was thinking about resilience, particularly with your book, because there was, again, those characters they're so marked by life, but they're as harsh on themselves in many cases as they are towards people around them.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that I really wanted to do with this novel, because it's a novel with horror and supernatural elements, so it is a relatively dark kind of novel. But I did want to show that even in the darkness, there are moments of connection and grace and compassion, and that is what really lifts people out. And so when we take collective responsibility for the traumas that people feel and for helping them be resilient, so we're collectively resilient, I think that's where positive outcomes happen.
Absolutely. Natasha, I mean, it feels similar for your story as well, because your characters lean on very particular things for their resilience. I mean, Indu is, at the heart of the traditional family unit in that, like, the traditional sense of that. But, she's a mother. She also feels very separate from the life that she kind of once knew. Vijay, he's very heavily focused on traditions, and, he has deep, profound love for his wife and his family, but it comes out in initially very strange ways. And I think Arch, I mean, in addition to reading the book, I also kind of saw what other people thought, and the words that a lot of people described was that she's a very distant figure. She uses self-defense. She sometimes uses distance as a self-defense weapon very much in this story. But when she kind of uses it to protect herself from a family that doesn't really understand her. But ultimately, that they kind of fall back into that resilience of the family unit as a key part of their story.
I mean, well, I agree with what Zahid said about, the word resilience and how we measure it. So, even for Arch, that distance is a form of resilience because she's surviving in the only way she knows how. And Indu is a baby wrapped in, layers and layers of depression or isolation in herself, but that also is a form of survival and resilience. So, yes, it doesn't look healthy from the outside, and yes, it's not probably good for a long-term thing, but when we meet these people, it's how they know to keep going, and ultimately those things you hope will fall away and that they find something else. But that's what I was kind of thinking about when I was thinking about these people and how do they survive their present and their history.
Yeah, and I think it's so good to contrast it with Claire, Lisa, in her book, in your book, because, I think Claire is an incredibly resilient individual. But the thing is that until she learns more and more and more, she doesn't understand. She doesn't realize how much of it comes out until she kind of grows and starts to understand this situation and starts to understand the consequences of being with Ray and being surrounded with this club and kind of everything around it from that. The more reckless she gets in terms of trying to find out the truth, and of course, you kind of alluded to the fact that she's an anaesthetist. She wants to explore, maybe using drugs to try and find out more. The more reckless she becomes.
Spoiler.
I know, another one. Don't worry, there's more. There's more spoilers. I won't say more. But so many more of the elements around her start to make sense. I feel like the actual unfurling of the book is also an unfurling of her. It's natural. It's kind of part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think resilience is a bit of a loaded term, I think. That which doesn't kill us makes us stronger, But sometimes, certainly Claire is a very strong person, independent, a little bit like Art. She tends to be isolated, deliberately isolates herself because she doesn't trust people because of her past. She's estranged from her family as well for different reasons. She's an ex-Jehovah's Witness. So she was thrown out of her family and her community as a young adult and has issues with trusting anyone. Put her trust in her husband, who she, as she unravels the story and more information about him, learns that perhaps that was misplaced trust and that he was keeping a lot of secrets from her. And so she goes further into herself and makes more reckless decisions as she unravels. And that could be seen as resilient. That's how she's coping. She's grieving. She's trying to reconcile that grief with these discoveries about, you know, the marriage that she thought was one thing and was actually another. And so none of that is healthy either. They're not healthy coping mechanisms, but they're what she resorts to. And you're absolutely right. What she needs to do is accept help from others. So I think rather than resilience, being open to help is what most of these characters need.
It's funny, this kind of came through in all of your books. I kind of started to notice it the more I read them. Another thing that I was particularly interested in for all of your books was your use of place a lot. And Natasha, for your book, place is critical. There is, you know, kind of the comparison that we have, because there's so many dual timelines. We start in India in 1970, kind of on one timeline, but then we also have Archer's timeline, and she's very much been in she was born in India, but a lot of her experiences is in contemporary Australia, or over that time. India is someone who's very much in her element in India, and then struggles more and more and more in Australia and in this family setting. And Arch wants to be anyone, but because she doesn't, this family really struggles to understand her, and she kind of is developing in herself, her sexuality, everything around that. She doesn't really get her sense of completion until she kind of, or at least an element of a sense of completion or real growth, until she really does start to put that distance between them. That scene with her and Vijay, where Vijay tries to organise a marriage, effectively, and she is absolutely disgusted by it and furious by it. It also made me think, well, as much as she is distant, catharsis is also really critical to her story and that place within it. Tell me about place with her and that family.
So for Arch, because she has such difficulty asking for help and she is so estranged from her family, I was thinking for her in terms of place, a place of sanctuary, and not just sanctuary, but literally a hideaway. So her little cottage in the Blue Mountains is a place that she can literally escape to. Yeah. Every time she goes into the city to work, or every time she comes back from a trip, and even being around other people, when it gets too much, she can just retreat into this thing she's created for herself, which is both a sanctuary and also a fortress, because no one is allowed in. And so that was important to me, that she just have something that's entirely her own. And for Indu, leaving everything she knew that was so familiar to her, she unexpectedly finds a sense of place in the Blue Mountains as well, which is another point of connection between mother and daughter. And so she isn't comfortable with maybe the people she's around in terms of outside her family, but she's starting to discover a sense of place that, again, is that sanctuary, whereas, Vijay is all about the city. Like, he finds places in the city, like Western Sydney, that really speak to him and become his place. But, because I've read both these excellent novels, and I was thinking about how place is a sanctuary in Onslaught, but I guess in your book, All the Missing Place, can be sinister and quite creepy.
Very sinister.
Well, I guess if it's somebody else's sanctuary, then it probably is kind of sinister to you, and I definitely have that as part of it. But there are just so many places on display in my novel, because I have 9 different POVs technically, and so I really did want to have on display the the Australia and the Sydney that I kind of recognise. But with the detective character, I'd seen so many novels where you have a detective who grew up in the country and then moves to the city, leaving behind, whatever they've left, secrets to be uncovered. And then they return to the country only to have to reopen these old wounds in order to solve the case that they're after. And I thought, what if we just reverse that? So we take a character from the country and make the city the place of estrangement and the place that's kind of full of this psychic dread. And so that's what I wanted to do with that. And then I guess I have the inverse of that with the lawyer, which is what I was getting at with Sanctuary, where there's this city lawyer. She's grown up her entire life there. It was her husband's dream to move to the country, and after he passes, she kind of goes to live that dream. And it's his sanctuary in a way, and for her, it's a place of eeriness and haunting.
It's so interesting how place really becomes an extension of the characters. I mean, when I was doing a panel earlier today about the power of place, and talking about how place can not only be something that exerts an impact on you, on a character, on you, but place has their own stories within them, and that's particularly the case with with all the missing children. I do want to ask a little bit about Benji as well, because he has this he's very connected to his mother, and that's kind of another part of that relationship. They live together. Talk to me a little bit about Benji and also that setting, because it was such an interesting dynamic, because he's looking after his mother as well.
Yeah, so Benji, to put this in context, Benji is a recovering heroin addict who's moved back home to care for his ill mother, and then all sorts of odd things begin to happen. But with that particular place, I was kind of thinking about it as an externalization of the psyche. So, it has, even the house has the structure of his psyche with the consciousness above and the unconscious in the crawl space. And it's the things that he's repressed and hasn't fully dealt with that leak out from underneath the house and start to haunt him. So in that way, the place in which it's set is a mirror of his psyche as it's formed.
I think a great response to all of this, and kind of in addition to kind of the idea of acceptance, for example, for a lot of these characters, and the need for acceptance, is often, I think acceptance kind of comes out in place as well. And I think this is particularly the case for Claire. This is not a spoiler, again, this is not a spoiler for the end of the book, because I feel like I'm getting called out now, but place and grief are really intertwined with Claire, and I just was caught up in the imagery of Ray, of this place that Claire and Ray had for themselves. At the end of this story, Claire goes on a massive journey, and yet she has this line which kind of really stuck with me, which is, "This place is a part of me now." There's like an acceptance in there herself with this place that is now very different from the one that she had when she went at the start of this story.
Yeah. So my novel is, I guess, setting-wise, it's split between the hospital setting and the Blue Mountains setting. With Claire and Ray had this house that backs onto the bush in the Blue Mountains. So suburbia, but mountain-style suburbia, so they can't see anyone else from their house. And that was his house that she moved into. But it becomes a special place for her, absolutely. And then the broader mountains feature as well, and I used them for atmosphere. The weather as well plays into it, and those elements certainly reflect, I think, Claire's mood, and provide that and contribute to that tension, the thriller tension. I think the Blue Mountains are a great space, a great setting, atmospheric, beautiful, dangerous, changeable weather, and isolated at times. And all of that contributed to the atmosphere and mood of the novel.
Definitely, and it also contributes to kind of that last theme that really came out in all your books, which is grief. There is a lot of grief in these books, and for Claire, like, grief has been in her life before this book started. It's been in her life for a long, long time. Not only has she, she has that for her husband. She had a very like a close relationship as well that she also lost in the story, and then of course estrangement from her family as well. But then there's another sort of grief, which is kind of also almost a grief of the self. She kind of realizes that she's changed. Like as more comes out, she's experiencing grief for herself and her changing of herself as a person. And even that despite all of the lies that are exposed, she still has grief for this man that she married and fell in love with, which is telling.
Well, you would, wouldn't you? They've created a life together, and she opened herself up to this man and loved him. So, I mean, I think grief's really complicated, isn't it? I think it's the driving force for her, really, when you come down to it. Her way of coping with the grief is to try and get back to work as quickly as possible, to push it down. I think a lot of people do that. She resorts to drinking, substance abuse, anything to squash the pain. And for times at work, she can forget about that grief, and then it comes at her. I think, it comes out of nowhere sometimes in a patient who's just lost his wife. And then that sends her backwards as well. So, I mean, I think that's realistic. And I think we do all grieve different types of relationships. She's lost a very close friendship, and that can be very painful as well.
I think there's an amazing podcast called the Good Morning Podcast, which if you haven't listened to it, I strongly recommend. I think they did a great comparison. They described grief like dust, where it gets into the nooks and crannies of you. In time, suddenly you kind of learn to move on, but then all of a sudden something comes out, and then you realise the dust is still there in some way, shape, or form.
Well, Geraldine Brooks yesterday described it as a shark. Yeah. That you're swimming along, and then suddenly there's a shark comes out of nowhere. You think you're doing fine, and then grief swipes you from the side. Yeah.
And it's not even like the loss. It's for some. It's like not the loss of not the first or second anniversary, for example, of losing someone. That's the hardest. It's the 7th or the 8th or whatever, because it suddenly that you realise with time, it doesn't change unless you have that sort of catharsis or anything like that. Zahid, I know your book is filled with grief, with all of these characters. I mean, it really comes out for Omar and Eileen. When I noticed it. He's marked by cold cases and kind of ghosts for the past and this trauma. And Eileen's event, oh God, with her husband, with Carl. Shh. I know, I'm not saying it. You should really buy this book. It's really, really good. I'm not kidding. But grief comes from, the grief can also come through from an inability to move on or getting stuck in their way, in her ways, particularly for Eileen, because you can see that she's trying so hard to give a great life to her children, but she struggles so hard, and it's kind of a grief for something that was lost in a way as well.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, that it's not necessarily grief over the loss of someone, it's grief over the loss of possibility that you might be affected by in that particular way. So you can grieve a different path that you might have been on with somebody or without somebody. You can grieve the loss of a life that you could have lived. And I think those two characters are really strong examples of that. But I mean, the barriers to her connection with her children are many, and they include her inability to open herself up completely and her inability to completely feel guilt about the event you're talking about.
Yes.
So because the event actually results in her having to grieve a different loss. So it's a choice of which grief she's going to feel.
Yes, that's right, which makes it so more infinitely more complex. And Natasha, grief in your book is, oh God.
These books aren't as depressing as they sound.
Yeah, I know, it isn't. I want to kind of actually preface with a small story that we've been talking about all day, and I feel like it's been following us around because it's an opportunity to do it. So I interviewed Madeline Cleary. I know, I'm sorry. And because I was doing the final preparation for this discussion, and I finally was like, I need to really kind of sit down with An Onslaught of Light a little bit more. And then I messaged Madeline at 11 o'clock saying, I think Natasha's wrecked me or destroyed me because there was a particular moment where I went back and read it again and went, oh my God, because it was such an intense moment. And kind of going back to the point of grief kind of appears in different places. I think that's especially the case for your book, particularly with VJ. 25 years down the track, suddenly he starts to notice the things that he's lost or the things that he's missed for his wife, for his daughter, and it kind of and grief kind of arrives in surprising places. But when it arrives for these characters, it is an avalanche. It is an avalanche of it. I think there's a really great section of the book where you kind of describe grief. It's sudden, it's fierce, and it takes over and racked. And I think this is for Arch when she's with Sonny, with her brother, and that her frame is racked with sobs and everything, and she's kind of being almost buffeted by a storm, in a way. Because for you, grief, it kind of, when the actual real events are hard and are going down, the characters are kind of going through the motions of it. But grief kind of comes later in this story.
Yeah, and I think that's generally how, well, I don't know how grief generally works, but there is an element of shock and disbelief, right, when you lose something or somebody. And it can take some time for the realisation to come in to your consciousness. And it's not about accepting that something is finished or someone is gone. It's about going, how do I now live without this thing? And as you said about possibilities, and I liked your shark metaphor. So I think for me it was about thinking about, how do you construct a life almost like there is this gaping hole inside you. The hole or the wound, the size of it doesn't change, but you grow around it and your ability to hold it becomes bigger. And sometimes there are days, weeks, months, years where your ability to hold it shrinks and then the hole feels huge, and then other times your capacity is much bigger and it feels manageable.
It's long and the short, these three books are amazing, and I think I'm so excited to see where all three of you go next in terms of examining either this subject matter or examining it in different stories and everything. I think now's a good time to kind of pivot and talk about the journey to publication, because debut authors, this is a new experience, and often we've talked about getting, I got signed by an agent, or a publisher came out, or I submitted this book to a competition and won a competition. When we were talking about this leading up, there was something that we all kind of came to an agreement that we wanted to discuss on, which is the challenge of actually framing a debut novel. The experience that I've had with debut novels around it is that often when you have these authors, it's the first time they're trying a novel. It's the first time, people are kind of taking a punt with you as a debut novelist or anything like that. I kind of feel like, why is it so challenging, for example, to get, I'll ask you first, Natasha, getting categorised? Because obviously your book, there's a historical element, there's a literary element, but getting framed is it can be quite a challenging thing for a debut author.
Yeah, and the way I think if you want to get traditionally published, the thing that you have to grapple with, that you can write something that's beautiful or really well written and have a high standard, but ultimately it comes down to how your publisher can sell your book at the fundamental level. So in order to sell your book, they need to know how to categorise it and where to put it next to and all your comparable writers. So the challenge for my novel initially was that literary fiction is very hard in Australia right now. That was a few years ago as a debut writer, which obviously I can do nothing about that. And then things flip. And then 2 years ago, it was like debut authors writing literary fiction is so hot right now. We totally want this. So a lot of that is out of your control. So all you can do really is to support the publisher so you need to have, I think, a really good idea of where your book might sit on the market, which sounds really boring, but once you get into it, it makes sense that you should know that, because I also feel like if you're reading a lot or you're reading in your genre, it also makes it easier to help or support that conversation about where to place it. That's probably, the challenge that I was facing for mine.
Yeah, It is such a thing that you don't necessarily think of whenever you're like, because you're like, I've got this story and I just need to get this story out, but then of course at the end of the day you've got to get it to an audience.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, just on that note, like, you shouldn't be thinking about that if you're writing something. You should just write it, and then think about that later. Because if you think about that from the beginning, then you're maybe writing something for an audience that you don't know may exist, or a place in the market that may change quite quickly. So just write whatever you're writing and work on that later.
I want to particularly ask this of you, Zahid, because like so many people have described your book like, yeah, it's a literary, there's mystery to it, but then when someone says horror, everyone's mind immediately flips to something, like they think of violence, they think of, horror movies and everything like that, which really changes kind of how your book is presented, which is very interesting. I know that this is something that you've kind of gone like, well, it's, books can be a little bit more complex than being categorized into this genre or this genre or this genre, right?
One of the difficulties I faced with this book was, the literal difficulty of where it's going to sit in a bookshop. And that's part of the process as well. Like, who's the audience for this? How are we going to market it? So my book has been classed as complex crime. It's been classed as mystery, as horror, as literary fiction. And it has elements of all of those genres. And when I was writing it, I expressly wanted to deal with these genres and confront the conventions of them in a way that was kind of unexpected. But I have never heard the word unique deployed so pejoratively when people describe my book as I have ever before. So it's been a really interesting kind of process. And I know that in some bookstores they've put it in the crime fiction section. But the compromise that I came to with the publisher was that we were going to slap a really weird cover on it and put it in the crime fiction section. So if you're approaching the crime fiction section, you're like, that doesn't look like the other books, which is kind of what the book ended up.
It's a great cover, though.
Oh, thank you. I didn't actually. Why am I saying thank you? I had nothing to do with the cover. It was. I do like the cover though, and I think that just puts people on notice that it's not a traditional crime fiction book, but that it has elements of crime fiction in it, and maybe it gives a bit of a horror vibe to it as well.
I think this is a good. I'll throw this question to you, Lisa, but it's kind of one for the whole panel a little bit, because obviously, at the end of the day, you have to sell books, and that's kind of the nature of the literary space, as with anything. But it is kind of what is the best way forward? Because if you do want those books to dive into different ways of looking at things, you want books that are challenging, you want books that throw things out. But is it a simple case of this is the situation that we work now with genre categorization or anything like that to sell your story? Is there another way to break that down?
Look, I think genre is important, as you mentioned, for publishers, for bookshops, so they know what shelf to put it on. I don't think it's something that we authors necessarily consider when we're putting a story together. I didn't set out to be a crime writer. That wasn't my goal in life. I had a story that I wanted to tell that sort of turned out to be a crime novel. And then once I started working with my editor, she said, this is going to be read by crime readers. Crime readers have expectations, genre expectations. I think we need to add a few red herrings. We need to make a slightly bigger twist. This is the one I was working with the publisher. So genre is really important for selling books. It's really important for, conveying the message of what the book is about, who the ideal reader for this book is going to be, and the cover plays into that, as Zahid said. And I think all of that needs to align so that the reader's not disappointed when they buy a book and it's not what the cover promised, and it's on the crime shelf and it's not really crime, or as mine sometimes ends up in literary fiction, and I think people will be disappointed because it's a crime novel in the end. But yes, there's a bit of confusion. My publisher's quite a literary publisher. My novel probably is, well, I don't know. I think it's a straight thriller, but it's probably slightly more literary.
Thriller.
Yeah, so at times people don't know where to shelve it. But I think for selling books, genre is important, and meeting those genre conventions is important.
I would probably add, though, if you are a writer going out there to write a book, it is useful to just write the best damn book that you can possibly write. You know, if you start second guessing what the conventions are and where this is going to sit, you'll probably end up outsmarting yourself in a particular way, and the book won't get to sit anywhere. So the first thing you should do is just focus on writing the best thing you can.
I think there's a great quote by Margaret Atwood, and I think this is kind of the real answer to the question at the end, is that, you know, somewhere out there, the quote is, somewhere out there is an audience that will read your book. Yeah. And the key thing is, at the end of the day, write it. That is what's most important. And eventually, in time, that book will go on its journey after it's published and make its way to the people who will want to read it and will be excited to read it, because that's what they'll be naturally gravitating towards. I think now is a really good opportunity for any, you know, readers or writers in the room who might have questions for our panel. We'd like to throw it out to any particular members of the audience who would like to ask some questions. Do we have any questions that we would like to ask our panel? Hello, yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, all of you. It was so great to hear about your books and about your experience. But I guess I'd love to know what has surprised you most about debuting.
I'll throw it to you first, Natasha. I guess for everyone. Yeah.
What has surprised me the most? Time. How long everything takes. Honestly, didn't fathom how much time there takes for every part of the process, from editing to the marketing, the getting it on the shelf. So just to give you an example of what I mean by time, I signed my publishing contract in 2023. In May 2023, and my book has been out for 1 month. So I had to wait nearly 2 years from just signing it. So time, that's been the biggest surprise.
Great question, Hayley. I think for me, I'm pretty an even-tempered person, and I felt like I was emotionally prepared, but I think that the highs and lows that hit you out of nowhere, those emotional highs and lows have been the biggest surprise for me. It's been months of highs and lows, and every little slight feels huge at the time. It's like you're like your skin's stripped back and your insides are exposed, and you say, "Have a go at me, everyone." You know, it is quite exposing. But now looking back, I think maybe I've hardened up to that a little bit, or just maybe put things in perspective a little bit more. But I think it was the emotions that were surprising for me.
I think for me it was probably both how small and how supportive the Australian writing community is. Like, you don't really know what that's going to be like when you go into it, but you meet people who are really accomplished and who are really happy to have a conversation with you about writing, about where you are, about anything. Or you can go to, I was at the Crime Writers Festival, and part of me felt like a bit of a fraud because I was like, is this really crime? But, you know, people were really lovely and inviting to me there. And so I've met so many great and supportive writers and really gotten a sense of how warm the Australian writing community is.
That's a great answer. I love that one. Do you have any other questions? We got two, or either one.
Okay, thank you. I know all of you will have been longing for this debut to happen. All right. What has been the most joyous part of it? You know, was it different to what you thought it was going to be?
There's so many highs, so many joyous parts. I mean, I think seeing your book for the first time is pretty joyous. Loaded, like I didn't open my box of books for a day because I thought, what if I'm not excited? But I was excited. Seeing your book on shelves. But I think the highlight for me has been hearing from readers, friends, family, and people that I don't know at all message me or email to say that something's touched them. I had an email from a woman who emailed me through my website. She said, "I'm halfway through your novel." Her name was Marjorie. She said, "I just had to tell you, there's a patient in the book called Jim, whose wife Marjorie, who's 80-something, his wife Marjorie recently died, and they'd been married for 60 years. She said, I had to tell you, I'm in my 80s. My husband, Jim, is 86. We got married in 1966. And she said, it's me, it's us down to a T, except that I'm not dead. That was a highlight.
That's a great one. Yeah, it's probably something similar for me, but it's when people talk to you not only about things that have moved them, but about things in the novel that they've seen that you didn't necessarily see or put there. Because I think one of the things when you write a novel is that it's very personal to you, and you don't know how it's going to resonate with other people. And when other people not only have an emotional experience with it, but say, oh, you know, when this moment here happened, I noticed this particular thing. And you go, oh yeah, that's really great. I totally meant that, you know. So, and I find that a really fun and you know, invigorating part of the experience.
Yep, definitely everything you both said. And I guess as well, this kind of thing, like we get to sit here and share our stories with you all, and it's so amazing. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for sharing your journey so far. I've heard advice before that publishers look for people who have an established social media presence so that you can leverage that. That seems quite disingenuous if you don't have that to start with. Would you say that was important in your journey?
For me personally, no, because I heard that too ages ago, and I had better advice, which was do what you feel comfortable doing. So if social media is your thing, you should do that. If something else, like you have a big network or community or whatever, you should do that. I think it helps if you are already somebody with like a high profile, like an influencer or somebody who is very active. But for me personally, that didn't matter at all.
Yeah, I'm reasonably active on social media, but it's more about community building for me. I think unless you're publishing non-fiction and you need to be an expert with a large following, in fiction, I don't think it's something that they look at particularly closely.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although I was talking to Selena Gomez the other day, and she said it really helped her get her work in. No, I didn't have any social media before publishing the novel. I'm sure that if you have an already established, really large social media following, that's probably going to add a few zeros to your advance. But if you are looking to get published and you're writing, in Australia and writing literary fiction or whatever it is, I don't think not having a social media account is going to be an impediment to that.
It is a good way to meet other writers, though, and connect with other people who are at the same stage of the process as you, or maybe even slightly ahead, so you can build that community, before you really need it, or when you really need it.
Do we have any others? Or we've got two. 1, 2, 3. Oh, wow. I think we've got one over here, and then we'll do these two down the front.
Hi. I think following on actually from what you just said, the question of when you can call yourself a writer. So I've heard it said, if you write, you're a writer. When did you feel, and I'm not quite sure in terms of the careers you had before writing, and I know we heard about your awards and accolades that you had beforehand. At what point did you say, hey, I'm actually a writer, rather than I'm this and writing's my side gig? Is it actually when you've achieved those awards, or is it now that you've got your debut published book, is that, hey, now I'm actually a writer? When was that point for you?
Well, I'm still a anaesthetist/writer. I can't quit the day job just yet. I don't know. I think claiming it is important. If you take it seriously, if it's not just a hobby, if you have aspirations to publish your work and share it, even in any space, I think claim it and call yourself a writer.
Absolutely. I think if a writer writes, and if you're writing, I think you're a writer. For me, this funny thing happened in my head where I'd published a whole host of short stories before publishing my novel, and so I was calling myself a writer. And then when I published the novel, I was like, now I'm an author.
Yeah, graduated.
Yeah, it makes very little sense, but in my mind, I felt much more comfortable calling myself an author once I had the novel, whereas before I could only call myself a writer.
And just to add to that, all of that I agree with, but you just have to practice saying it with authority and confidence. And once you say it a few times, and also talking to other writers, like no one ever goes like, "Who are you? Like, what do you publish?" Like no one ever worries about that. Like writerly conversations are the best because you just literally just start talking about books and you talk about your ideas, and it doesn't matter where you're at stage-wise.
We've got 2 more down the front here. Do you guys want to do this?
So now that your debut novels are out, looking back, what advice would you give your, self-doubting imposter syndrome selves?
I mean, I'm still a self-doubting imposter syndrome self, so it's hard. But I think the thing that I would suggest that people cultivate is balance when it comes to their approach to writing. So you do need a certain amount of ego and stubbornness and faith in order to keep going with whatever you're writing. But at the same time, you have to have humility and openness to take advice, to realize that you can improve. And if you don't have a combination of those two things, you might not get to the end of whatever you're writing. And I think a similar thing is true when it comes to intuition, creativity, and structure. Like you do need to be able to follow your intuition, to be creative, to play on the page. But at some point, and this point varies with different writers, you need to have some idea of the structure of your novel and what you're trying to achieve with it.
That's a great question, Zora. I think I would tell imposter syndrome doesn't go away. It just drifts off for a little while and then it comes back with a vengeance. You've just got to fake it till you make it, really. And I think I would tell myself to just not be so impatient to get published. I wrote another novel that will never be published, and that's fine. I mean, most people have written novels that don't get published. It's a craft, and you've got to learn it, and it takes time. And I'm glad that unpublished book never got published because the next book I wrote was better and more true to me. And I think I would advise my unpublished imposter syndrome self to just slow down and keep going and fake it till you make it.
I mean, I actually agree with all those things and part of my experience, but I suppose what I would tell my then self is when there's a sense of urgency to kind of be able to just tolerate that, because it doesn't, if you don't do something, you're not able to write something, you're not able to get something submitted, it's okay, because, there's always room for stories.
Thank you.
I'd just like to ask, thank you for all coming today, but how do you get to find that publisher?
Oh, big one.
In 2 minutes.
Sorry, did you ask how do we find that publisher? Wow, okay. So I guess there's many, many ways into publishing. So some people have agents who help support them to do that submission. For me personally, I was very much looking at the types of publishers who might publish what I was writing, and also publishers who were open to submissions, what they call the slush pile, when you submit directly, because I don't have an agent. And at that time, that was what I was focusing on, publishers that publish similar stories to mine and that would accept my submission.
I tried to get an agent and failed. There's not many in Australia. I then sort of went through the process of pitching publishers, entering competitions, published manuscript prizes and so on, and then eventually got picked up from a slush pile.
And I think that's the path that you should probably follow in that order. So, agents have open periods where you can submit to them. If you don't get an agent, then you can go directly to the publisher through the slush pile. You can also enter competitions to kind of get a reputation as a writer, and you can also apply for grants. So that's another thing. Grants and residencies can help you get into print.
There's so many great ways to write and bring that all together. I think that the best word of advice that I've ever heard was from a certain Neil Gaiman, who said, "This is how you do it. You sit down and you type out every single word until it is done. It is that easy and that hard," effectively. It has been so fun chatting with all of you about the process of writing books. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I would like to extend a warm thank you to Zahid, Lisa, and Natasha for joining me today. It's been a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will finish off by also saying, if you've enjoyed the festival, please let the Newcastle Writers Festival know. We're on all the socials using the hashtag NWF2025. If you like this discussion, you can also check out my podcast, Date with a Debut, which has all of these discussions every single week. You know, I would also like to extend a warm thank you to all of the amazing volunteers who I think have done a phenomenal job with this festival. Thank you so much for coming out, and we hope that you enjoyed the 2025 Newcastle Writers Festival. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut, and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It really helps the show out. If you want to hear episodes when they drop, be sure to subscribe to Words and Nerds, or you can subscribe to Date with a Debut on Podbean to hear the latest episodes as they drop. Want to support the show more? You can also subscribe to my Patreon in the description to get early access to episodes, book reviews, recommendations, and a whole lot more. Catch you soon! Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art podcast co-production.